Welcome to this ORF conversation. I have with me Jeff Smith from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He is widely acclaimed as an expert on South Asian affairs, on Indian affairs, Indian foreign policy, Indian strategic affairs, and he's been a consistent supporter of a close association and a close alliance between India and America. I also have with me Indrani Bagchi. She's the Foreign Affairs Editor of Times of India, a policy wonk, and she goes by the Twitter handle Horror. Am I right, Indrani? Horror or horror something?
Horror 06.
Okay. And we are going to talk about the ongoing situation between India and China along the line of actual control in East Ladakh. There have been a series of talks between the two military commanders, and we are told that right now there is a step-by-step or a graded de-escalation happening, of which some details are known, but most of the details still remain unknown, and no one really knows the time frame that has been worked out or has been figured out by both the armies to bring about some sort of a normalcy and restore status quo ante over there. Jeff, I thought today we would talk about the US response to the flashpoint. There have been several statements out of DC and including some very encouraging statements after India went ahead and banned 59 Chinese apps as obviously as a retaliation to the Chinese perfidy. How do you see the American response and India's response to the American response?
Yes, so from the very beginning, I would actually go back to May, and then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Alice Wells, who has been really the point person at the State Department for South Asia for really the past 4 years. She's recently retired, but she's been the key South Asia person at State, made a very strong statement in support of India and in condemning China's behavior at the line of actual control and in condemning Chinese aggression and linking it to Chinese behavior elsewhere in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, noting that this is a pattern of Chinese aggressiveness. And we've seen some smaller statements since then from Secretary Pompeo and others noting Chinese aggression at the LAC. But for the most part, I would say the Trump administration has been fairly muted on this topic. And I think that's in part because the Indian government often signals to the US government that it wants it to remain out of the public diplomacy of the crisis. We want you to be helpful behind the scenes. We welcome your support, but we don't want America to inject itself in this China-India dispute. We can handle this on our own. But there still has been these occasional statements of support. And as you know, Secretary Pompeo was quite direct and supportive of this proposal to ban 59 Chinese apps from the Indian market. I was somewhat surprised how direct he was in his language. I think, there may be some concerns in the US about digital sovereignty issues in India, protectionism issues in India, that this could apply more broadly and eventually hit US firms. But if it remains a targeted specific measure aimed at the Chinese, there's a lot of movement in Washington right now toward insulating ourselves from Chinese espionage efforts, Chinese tech companies that have very shady history of data security, of invading privacy. And so I think you will find a supportive environment in Washington for efforts like this that are seen as retaining your sovereignty in the face of Chinese pressure. We know China uses these tech companies not necessarily for immediate financial revenue, but to gain market share, to gain your data. Data is the new gold. And I think it really does hurt the Chinese when you deny them the data of hundreds of millions of Indian users that, yes, will be used later to gain market share and to gain financial rewards, but also to get your information and what you can do with that information. I think when you're retaliating, you want to hit China where it hurts, and you want to find out what they want. And they do want your data.
I mean, it's almost coincidental. The US action, which came, I think, 24 or 48 hours ago against Huawei and ZTE, they have now been virtually banned from American shores. Indrani, do you sense a reluctance in Delhi? And I think it's a strange reluctance to get others talking about China's salami tactics, call it salami tactics, call it uh, intrusion by stealth, grabbing territory by stealth. And it's not only India. I mean, they've done it now with Nepal, with Bhutan. Uh, they are looking at Japanese islands. They are trying to, or at least they are rattling their sword with Taiwan. Why are we so reluctant to get the world talking about it?
Well, I think I don't see them being reluctant about a lot of other countries. I think the US is special in this respect because the Chinese have it triggers a very different reaction from the Chinese than if the Australian Prime Minister, for instance, was saying, which he did, that sort of expressing solidarity. But I will say that this time I have seen there is less reluctance on the Indian part. I mean, Alice Wells, as Jeff said, was the first one. It was a very strong remarks that she had made. I didn't see any pushback from the Indians. Secretary Pompeo has gone on record several times, and even, I mean, President Trump, of course, has said that he wanted to mediate, but that's, I mean, the Indians sort of skirted that bit. But I think Secretary Pompeo's remarks have been repeated remarks, and I don't see a pushback by the Indians this time in that sense. Yes, there is a traditional thing about India wanting to do this by itself with the Chinese. I think there is a recognition that this time the nature of the Chinese intrusion, the nature of Chinese aggressiveness, the scale of the build-up is actually far more threatening or very different from what we have seen in the past few years. And definitely not Debsang, Chumar, not even Doklam.
Jeff, would you think that this is a good time that India and America could, and I'm just being provocative over here, that India and America could test out the logistics exchange memorandum of agreement, LEMOA, with a couple of American ships docking in both the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal? I mean, it would be a perfectly valid exercise.
I think it would. And I think, in fact, we should consider doing exercises in the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Indian Ocean, including around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This is something that was proposed by Ambassador Chinoy this week, head of IDSA, former ambassador to Japan, and I believe consul general in Shanghai. He suggested that India host exercises with the US and others off the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That's something I've been recommending for many years. You know, this is a strategic gold mine for India, one that has been, to date, I would argue, somewhat underutilized. But if you want to get the attention of the Chinese, I think you would do so by activating the command and using that more frequently as a site for joint exercises, tabletop exercises, growing familiarity between India and the US operating there, inviting other partners like Japan and Australia to do the same, and also in the Western Indian Ocean, in the Arabian Sea. I know that's been a point of interest for India to increase cooperation in the western half of the Indo-Pacific. It's not just the eastern half of the Indo-Pacific, where we often focus so much of our attention. But I think we need to broaden the spectrum of cooperation in the Indian Ocean and activate LAMOA. And we've seen in the past sometimes it has taken a crisis like this to jumpstart, to motivate us to take the next step. You know, I think it was the Doklam crisis and Indian opposition to the BRI that eventually prompted the revival of the Quad.
Absolutely.
That eventually pushed India to sign Kamkasa. And sometimes these types of crises can have a catalyzing effect like that. And maybe there can be a silver lining to this.
Indrani, any chatter in Delhi on any thinking about getting into the LAMOA Act at this point of time?
I'm not sure I've heard that yet, but I do know that they are open to activating all manner of action against the Chinese.
No,
Definitely.
what does it mean?
Okay. So I was told that we have now a large number of our ships out in the Indian Ocean. I think Indian ships have been tagging Chinese ships in the Western Indian Ocean. I think what I heard was their interest was much more, as Jeff said, in the Western Indian Ocean, because the logistics lines to China are much, much further away. And right now, China is actually constrained because there are 3 US aircraft carrier groups in the Western Pacific. So to have Indian ships harassing or interdicting Chinese ships in the Western Indian Ocean could be a pressure point. I think the Indians want to calibrate responses gradually. They're waiting to see how and if the de-escalation sort of timetable that has been agreed, whether that is acted upon. I've heard that there has been minor movements back from the face-off sites. Now, there are multiple face-off sites in Ladakh. It's not a single one like in Doklam. So there have apparently been minor face-off, minor disengagements, but nothing of any consequence. And the Chinese still remain on Singapore in Pangong. So not sure how we're going to be able to square that circle without either escalating violence at that point, or using a leverage at some other point, either on the LAC or in another space like in the sea. I don't see how we would be able to get them out from there peacefully.
Yeah, and I think the political pressure on the government in India is huge. I mean, they also can't pretend that everything is fine and let's forget about it. That's not going to happen. Jeff, coming back to coordinated action, for the first time, India has spoken up on Hong Kong at the UN Human Rights Commission. The US has not been sufficiently vocal. There was supposed to be a sanctions bill, but that didn't happen. And this could be a pressure point. International community could get together and build pressure on China using Hong Kong. Why do you think that's not happening?
Well, that's a good question, maybe better posed to those who watch China 24/7 here in Washington. I would say that the pressure has been ramping up.
Yes.
There have been a series of bills passed by the US Congress and a series of steps taken by the administration on Hong Kong, but also on the Uyghurs, also on Tibet, and a whole range of unilateral actions taken against Chinese firms like Huawei. There's issues being discussed now about semiconductors. So I don't know about the specifics of the response to Hong Kong. I think that's still being debated because it is a difficult issue. There still are a lot of friends in Hong Kong. There still are a lot of parties in Hong Kong who don't want to see a complete rupture with the United States, who don't want to be punished because China is essentially muscling in on the territory. But at the same time, we have to show China that this behavior is unacceptable. And so there is some calibrating on the Hong Kong question, but if you look at the broad spectrum of responses to China, the Trump administration and this Congress, I would argue, has been really quite proactive. And I do expect that to continue, regardless of how the election goes later this year. It may change in its color and character a bit, but the trend is secular and very clear toward greater accountability from China, greater confrontation where necessary, and greater efforts to hold China accountable for its behavior.
Indrani, anything more happening on the Hong Kong front apart from that one, not a very strong, but I would say a rather watery statement by India?
But just the fact that we've even made a statement is a first. We've never made these statements before. But we do have a big Indian diaspora in Hong Kong. I think the more important thing to look at in Hong Kong is not in terms of condemning Chinese action, because frankly, I don't think China cares. But it will be on the ground if Hong Kong's salience comes from it being a financial hub of East Asia. Frankly, although does not contribute as much as it used to the Chinese economy, but it still contributes a fair amount. And to use this as a step for businesses, for financial companies to step out of Hong Kong or to look for other financial hubs like Singapore, Bombay, would be far worse for the Chinese regime than just condemnatory statements.
So are we working on that?
We don't have that kind of clout. It would be, you've seen how the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which is a British bank, but it's essentially the central bank of Hong Kong. They have fallen in with the Chinese national security law. So you have to wait to see whether other companies, other financial companies, funds, etc., whether they prefer to accede to or adhere to that law, or whether they say that this is time for us to leave. I think you have to wait for that to play out. I don't think governments can get in there right now.
Jeff, which brings me to this point. We keep on talking about democracy. We keep on talking about international terms of engagement on the basis of a rules-based order. We talk about liberal democracies. And yet, and China is a very good example, the Western investor prefers a dictatorship over a democracy. Why? And even now, American tech companies are reluctant to make an exit from China, or for that matter, American investors.
Yes, it's true. It's puzzling to me at times as well, because it's been very clear for well over a decade that those Western firms entering China are making a sort of Faustian bargain, and they're trading near-term profits for long-term exposure to espionage and copyright infringement and intellectual property being stolen. And so many of them have now experienced this, and yet they continue pouring money into the Chinese market. As a non-businessman, it's been somewhat puzzling to me, but it is clear that China has done an effective job selling the prospect for at least short-term gains and market access, and at least some stability in how the rule of law is applied to these countries while they're in China temporarily, at least. India, it's my hope India had done a better job attracting some of these firms, but when I talk to folks here, they continue to tell me that the business environment in India remains poor, that there's not certainty about trade and investment laws, the regulatory system remains a huge burden, and there are a lot of trade and investment grievances here in Washington, both within the business community and within government, frankly, when you look at USTR's annual report. And so I think the Chinese have done a better job at least presenting companies with some regulatory certainty and with some promise of market share access and short-term benefits in a way that India has not been able to. And there's certainly more concern now among the business community about the environment in China and a search for alternatives. But we still don't know exactly how that's going to play out and who's going to end up capturing some of this market share seized by firms leaving China. And I think for India to do so is going to take some courageous economic reforms, to be honest.
But if I was
the mood in India has been rising against China and Chinese goods. You have in recent days we have seen Indian industry issuing statements that they will stop, or they will sort of phase out imports from China. They will stop using components made in China. And we have also heard individual American politicians calling for a boycott of Chinese goods. Anyway, sorry, Indrani, you were making a point.
No, I was just saying that if I was a businessman, I would actually invest in China. As a company, you're looking at your next quarter, and there is predictability in China, which there isn't in India. We have to recognize that. There is better infrastructure in China, which there isn't in India. Even with this government, there has been flip-flops on policy, on regulation. That makes any investor nervous. So I see no reason for an investor to not prefer a dictatorship. I think they're completely sort of eclectic about that. Then I don't think they care whether there's a dictatorship or not. Whether if they get what they need, which is a profit, and they are, why would they not prefer China? As for Indian businessmen, frankly, they are very risk averse as well. So for them they would have to take reform. They would have to undertake reforms as well. It is not only the Indian government that has to undertake reforms. It is the Indian corporate sector that has to undertake reforms as well. It's not just a question of us being able to make it easy for foreign companies. Indian companies also have to be able to function better, and that is not always the government's fault.
So, Jeff, the last question is for you. Do you still see some sort of an international coalition growing out of China's latest moves, not only vis-a-vis the LAC with India, but with Japan, with Taiwan, with Indonesia, with Bhutan, with Nepal, and the general level of aggression which continues to rise with each passing day? Do you see that there is still scope, or it is going to happen, So, I mean, I keep on talking about it, an international coalition of democracies against China.
Yeah, I don't know if there's ever going to be a sort of moment where the light switch flips on and all of a sudden this coalition appears and it's explicitly aimed at containing Chinese behavior. But we will continue to see increasing levels of cooperation and this network of trust and activity among like-minded partners, something that frankly the US has been trying to build for years now, but there has been reluctance on the part of others to follow our lead at times. And what we've seen over the last few years is growing movement as threat perceptions around China have been rising. And I think the COVID pandemic, just over the last few months, Chinese actions and belligerence has pushed a lot of interest groups in different capitals that were either sort of on the fence or a little skeptical of becoming too confrontational with China. I think Chinese actions over the past few months have pushed them toward a more assertive response. And you just saw recently in Australia, they've unveiled a very ambitious new plan for defense spending over the next decade. I think India has maybe been the biggest change. You know, things that the Indian government was very hesitant or reluctant to do even a few years ago, it's now become a much more willing and engaged partner. And so we're going to continue to see these linkages among the Quad in particular, but also many more of the Europeans are finally beginning to come around, and other partners in the Indo-Pacific that are facing Chinese pressure, like Malaysia and Indonesia, I think are gradually growing more skeptical. And it will be a looser coalition than the type of balancing coalitions or containment coalitions we saw during the Cold War or in previous centuries. It will be looser, but it may be wider and it may be more effective if we can have a strong core of that coalition. And I believe the strong core would be comprised of the Quad, because I believe these four countries are uniquely willing and able to push back against Chinese aggression. China does not hold a veto in any of these four countries. It does not hold a preponderance of economic influence. It does not have elite capture. It can't turn the screws in the same way that it can among a lot of its neighbors, which is in part why I think it falls on the Quad to lead this response. We are the four Indo-Pacific democracies that can say no, that can push back when we must. And so the burden is going to fall to us. And that's why it's hopeful to me that India has really, in the past few years, sort of come around on the Quad. And hopefully now, after the latest LAC crisis, becomes even more ambitious.
That was an excellent look into what could be the future. I'm sorry, but we have run out of time, and I'm sure we'll meet again. This conversation will continue. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Indrani, for joining me today.
Thank you.